Oscar, how familiar are you with the country of Brazil?
They speak Portuguese. They have that really cool Carnival festival. And about 60% of the Amazon rainforest is in Brazil.
That's a pretty solid list, Oscar. Well done.
Thank you.
Did you know that about 13% of Brazil's territory is protected indigenous or native reservation land, and approximately 98% of that is in the Amazon region?
Wow, I did not know that.
I bring it up because that land is in danger of losing its protected status, and the indigenous Brazilians are gathering to protest in front of government buildings to protect their ancestral lands. Check it out.
Estamos aqui para somar e para lutar em defesa do nosso povo e para a igualdade, as nações, os povos, saber que nós indígenas somos os primeiros habitantes do Brasil e estamos aqui para mostrar para o Brasil e para o mundo que nós não morremos, né? Nós somos a história viva, nós somos os livros vivos.
As Chief Alberanon said, the indigenous communities are living history, and they are struggling to protect their land from the government. Their communities are at the forefront of protecting and preserving the Amazon rainforest, which is endangered due to the practice of deforestation by the farming industry in Brazil, who heavily support President Bolsonaro. Bill 191, which is being voted on in Brazil's Congress, would allow for oil exploration and a hydroelectric dam to be installed on reservation land. President Bolsonaro has said that he will not grant any more land to the indigenous community and accuses them of holding up the development of the country. As he said in an interview after his election in 2018, if we're up to him, quote, there won't be any more demarcations of indigenous land. Meaning indigenous land boundaries would no longer be protected. It was only in 1988 that the indigenous people gained legal rights to their land, and even now hundreds of communities are still struggling for recognition. Even though they have legal rights, these communities have fought for years to uphold their land security from miners, loggers, and poachers illegally entering and depleting the area of natural resources. However, Sonia Guajajara, head of the country's main indigenous umbrella organization, the Articulation of the Indigenous Peoples that represents most of Brazil's 900,000 indigenous people, has said that we will not retreat and is determined to get more indigenous representation in Congress. There is only one indigenous representative, Congresswoman Joina Wapichana.
You know, that kind of reminds me of the Standing Rock protests in North Dakota a couple years ago.
Great observation, Oscar. It is similar. The indigenous community was desperately trying to protect their water and sacred land of their ancestors from an oil pipeline running through it, but during the Trump administration, the pipeline was allowed anyways.
And that's awful. That doesn't seem right. If the land is theirs, how can the government just ignore the rights of the indigenous people?
Well, Oscar, indigenous communities around the world have been treated horrendously since the start of European expansion and colonization. Let me explain. When Europeans began to discover new worlds, they were actually just being made aware of places that already existed with large populations of people and cultures that held the earth and all of its natural resources in a high spiritual regard. Over time, as Europeans began to settle in the New World, a culture clash and power struggle began to develop. For example, in the 1500s, the Aztec civilization, located in modern-day Mexico, was taken over by Spanish conquistadors led by Hernán Cortés. Here in the U.S., President Andrew Jackson signed into law the Indian Removal Act, which forced the relocation of multiple indigenous nations from the southeast region of the country in order to take control of the land during the gold rush in Georgia, even though this land was supposed to be protected indigenous land. These indigenous nations included Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Seminole, among others. Their relocation was known as the Trail of Tears because the journey was over 5,000 miles and thousands of indigenous people lost their lives along the way. In the late 1800s, the Canadian government established residential schools. Indigenous children were forcibly taken from their families and communities and forced to learn how to live in a European society. This meant they were not allowed to speak their native languages or acknowledge their own heritage, and they would be severely punished if they broke these rules. They did not receive proper education and were mainly trained for manual labor. These children were not able to grow up with their families, to learn their culture and history, to pass down to their own families when they became adults. The last school of this kind closed in 1996. Indigenous communities have been marginalized since European colonization began. If Bill 191 passes in Brazil, it would be just another way the culture and history of these communities is undermined for financial gain. In Brazil, these reservations are one of the only things protecting the Amazon rainforest, and if the government is permitted to go in for drilling and farming, they could further destroy one of the last places on Earth naturally fighting against climate change. The Amazon rainforest contains approximately 123 billion tons of carbon above and below the ground. When the trees are cut down for farming, more of that is released into the atmosphere, which causes the global temperature to rise. So at the end of the day, these Indigenous protesters are not just fighting to protect their land, but also to protect the planet.
Wow, that is really scary. All the stuff about Indigenous people and the fact that the Amazon rainforest is in a lot of trouble too.
It is, Oscar. Hopefully the protest brings awareness to the Indigenous people of Brazil and they're able to continue to protect their land, which is really protecting all of us.